Meanwhile, explosions have destroyed all tunnels, control centers and police posts at the DPRK's nuclear test site. Punggyeri is where the country carried out all 6 of its nuclear tests since 2006. Journalists from South Korea, China, Russia, the US and the UK were invited to watch the demolition, including our correspondent Peng.
We are now on a green-skin chartered train heading all the way back to the country's eastern coastal city of Wonsan. Our mobile phone just came back into signals. At 4:20 p.m. local time, the DPRK announced to reporters that it had successfully dismantled its Punggyeri nuclear test site. The explosions took place in front of the cameras of around 30 reporters from China, Russia, the United States, the United Kingdom, and South Korea. Altogether, the DPRK has blown off 3 tunnels, which they say they built to conduct nuclear tests. The most notable tunnel is tunnel number 2. It was where the DPRK conducted 5 out of its 6 nuclear tests, including the most recent one in September 2017, after which the DPRK claimed it had successfully detonated a hydrogen bomb able to be carried by intercontinental ballistic missiles. That tunnel went down before our eyes at 11 a.m. local time. The other 2 exploded tunnels, number 3 and number 4, were not used for tests before. The DPRK told us that the explosions of Tunnel 3 is particularly a big deal because it was newly built and can be used to carry out nuclear tests anytime at their will. It has been fully laden with explosives and came at 2 p.m. local time. It's a great show of faith in seizing nuclear tests from the DPRK. The last tunnel, tunnel number 4, was designed to test what the DPRK calls very powerful nuclear tests, and it was blasted at 4 p.m. local time. I said that at this point, it's still hard for reporters to independently verify to what extent these tunnels have been dismantled. The DPRK officials did not answer our question whether they will invite international weapon experts to come and check. Now, about radiation. Radiation leaks has always been a concern for both experts around the world and reporters who get close to the site for the very first time this time. Deputy head of the DPRK's Nuclear Weapon Institute told us on the site that the previous tests and explosions this time has neither caused leaks of radioactive materials nor adverse impact on ecological environment. But as the reporters arrived in DPRK's airport on Tuesday, the customs confiscated all the Geiger counters from the reporters, which can be used to detect nuclear radiation. And as we arrived at the nuclear test site on Thursday and started covering the explosions, I saw that many reporters had brought with them their face masks or even full-body hazmat. They say better safe than sorry. But along the winding mountain roads connecting the tunnels, we have seen some thick plants covering the hills and small insects flying around us, and also we can even hear the sound of birds above our heads. So there seems to be nothing out of the picture in terms of nature, but again, I have to say it depends on the experts to really make a conclusion.
Right, and Nathan King is following the developments from Washington and joins us live from there. Nathan, what's the likely impact of this cancellation on diplomatic efforts on the Korean Peninsula?
Yeah, I mean, are we back to square one? Remember, just under a year ago, there was all that rhetoric that everyone thought was going to lead to war. US President Donald Trump calling Kim Jong-un little rocket man, and Kim Jong-un calling the US president a dotard. You know, it was pretty hectic, but after a lot of shuttle diplomacy, it looked like we might get this summit, but that was dashed in just a few short paragraphs in that letter. So the big question now is, what will the US do? As we heard there, the US president really not ruling out the fact that the summit could be held at a later date, even saying it might be on track for June 12th, although that is very unlikely considering the letter and the rhetoric that we've seen over the last couple of days. So he is still holding out. In fact, in that letter, he said, essentially, call me, write me, Kim Jong-un. And it seems like they may have had conversations before, given what the letter said as well. So it's not being ruled out. But essentially, when it came to the negotiating positions leading up for June 12th, there was a dramatic difference. Denuclearization for the US essentially meant handing over all your missiles, all your material, give it to us, we'll destroy it, and then we'll start talking about economic benefits. And as you know, Pyongyang and Seoul had basically devised an approach between themselves and hoped it would go to the US as well, about a step-by-step approach where you would build confidence over time. The problem with the US is they think they've been sold this horse before. In several other rounds of negotiations, they've seen initial steps from the DPRK, like the destruction of the nuclear test site that Peng has been amazingly at this week. That's happened before, and yet they haven't denuclearized. So there's been a big reticence on part of the Trump administration to buy the same horse again. Now, remember, the US president also says that maximum pressure will continue. That was diplomatic, that was economic, but it was also military as well. And you do get a sense that the hawkish advisors around the US president, I'm talking about John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, also the US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, and Mike Pence as well, have definitely got the upper hand here at the moment. But on the one hand, you have the US threatening the full power of its nuclear arsenal, but also on the other hand, extending a hand saying talks could continue. So it's going to be important. But one thing I do want to stress is that the alliance that the US built up for the maximum pressure campaign, which of course included Beijing, Seoul, Japan, everyone was tightening sanctions, may now disappear because it looks like the US has unilaterally pulled back from this, and there is obviously a willingness on the Korean Peninsula from Seoul to continue these talks, and also from Beijing and others as well. So the US may find itself isolated when it wants to keep that maximum pressure campaign up.
And Nathan, the decision comes as the DPRK dismantles its nuclear testing site, like you mentioned. Is this likely to have been pre-planned, and is the US preparing for a backlash from the DPRK?
Yeah, well, I mean, remember, this was actually something that Kim Jong-un did in the wake of the Inter-Korean Summit, that historic meeting along the 38th parallel in the Peace Village, and basically was meant to be a confidence-building measure. Although, as you know, these things, when you don't have weapons inspectors and nuclear experts in, if it's just for the cameras, they are not verifiable, as Peng said. But what it did do, and quite dramatically, we have the juxtaposition now of the images coming through of those towers and tunnels being blown up at the same time that the US president blows up the summit. Now it looks like the DPRK is moving towards lessening tensions just as the US pulls out. That is not a position Washington wanted to be in. The DPRK have had a public relations success with this trip. They had a public relations success with President Moon as well. So it's going to be interesting to see how much of the international community will point the finger at Pyongyang over this collapse and how much will point the finger at this house behind me, the White House.
All right, Nathan, we appreciate you joining us. Thank you very much. Nathan King live for us there in Washington. But let's continue with this conversation. And joining me now from the U.S. city of Missoula is Dr. Abraham Kim. He is the director of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center at the University of Montana and an expert on Korean Peninsula issues. Dr. Kim, thank you for joining us. What's the significance of the decision by the DPRK to dismantle its nuclear testing site?
Well, from a nuclear capability standpoint, it really means nothing because we know already that the North Koreans have a nuclear arsenal as well as a delivery system. But I think the more significant aspect of this is really the diplomatic side. The North Koreans were signaling to the US, South Korea, China, and the rest of the international community that it was moving forward and serious about coming to the negotiation table to talk about the future of the nuclear program. Meanwhile, on the other side, we heard from senior foreign ministry officials that they were very critical of the U.S. administration as well as threatening to pull out of the summit. So this was a classic diplomatic of mixed signals from the North Koreans, suggesting that they want to move forward, but also they're trying to shape the diplomatic table or the negotiation table prior to the two heads of state meeting together on June 12th. But as we know from today's news, that has been canceled.
Now, should South Korea perceive the security threat level from the DPRK to have been significantly reduced?
Well, again, as we know from today's announcement that the summit is canceled, this is playing out as we speak. In terms of South Korea's own security, President Moon has actively tried to bring the North Koreans and also work with the Trump administration to allow this negotiations to take place in June. But now with the cancellation of the summit, we could either go one of two ways. We're waiting for the North Koreans to respond, and if Kim Jong-un's regime decides to ratchet up tensions, this could actually lead to further tensions. Or if the Kim Jong-un regime decides to come back and I guess to re-engage the U.S. and also take President Trump's offer on possibly reviving these talks maybe at a later point, then this could lead to further stabilization. But right now, it's too early to tell, and this is all playing out as we speak.
Dr. Kim, what, in your opinion, is the long-term strategy of the DPRK in terms of its foreign policy?
I think the long-term strategy here is obviously regime survival. And the North Koreans are looking for two things: security guarantees to ensure that their long-term future and the long-term future of the regime is sustained into the future. And that's through these peace regimes, possibly of a peace treaty sometime in the future, that would lead to certain kinds of normalization of the relations with the U.S. and possibly with South Korea. The other part of this calculus is economic development. North Korea is very seriously in economic troubles. They need trade, they need investments, and they need foreign aid. And only through engaging with the international community will they be able to get this. And one of the main sources will obviously be not only South Korea, but also the United States. So overall, this is all meant to help the longevity of the current regime.
The U.S. has cancelled the planned summit between President Trump and the DPRK leader Kim Jong-un. So how will this affect America's ties with the DPRK going forward?
Well, we will have to see how this plays out over the next hours and next couple of days in terms of now with the cancellation of the summit. It could go in one of two ways, as I mentioned before. Right now, we're awaiting how the North Koreans will respond to this current situation. It could immediately ratchet up tensions on the Korean Peninsula if Kim Jong-un decides to respond militarily, or in a way that further insults the U.S. administration, and the Trump administration may respond negatively as well, and we'll get back into this negative spiral. If the North Koreans decide to take the opportunity and say, well, maybe we should push this off and push for another future date, and let's continue these conversations, then we may see these talks saved from a complete collapse, which many of us are hoping that it will not collapse.
Dr. Ibrahim Kim, we appreciate your insights. Thank you for joining us.